Hello every folks and good morning! Welcome to a discussion on some theories on the bug. So there is the Relic bug. It's a bit of a weird one. For those that don't know, or potentially might have blown it out of crazy proportion, literally you hear this bug described as the thing that caused people to stop playing, or had people declare the entire game broken, or what have you. And basically what it consists of is like in a case where spells are super effective, where like the user and the spell are matching and they are super effective and they have a weapon with a relic bonus, it essentially would just apply that relic it would just apply that bonus to that attack. So anyway, on the low end, like right here, he would be doing 238 if you were to go attack in a super effective state, whereas this guy abusing this crazy bug with a maxed out relic that's going to do this world-ending thing is applying like 30 extra damage. It's a weirdly specific bug is the thing. Now, basically what it comes down to is like, yeah, you can multiply this in some ways. Like if you were to go, for example, apply a Nature's Power, a maxed out relic, and essentially dump hundreds of stat charms onto somebody, you could potentially get the bonus up to like 150. But still, this is more so a quirk than a massive end of the world thing. But here's the thing, it's a weird bug, because it only applies to one-handed relics, and in fact two-handed ones are the thing that are actually bugged in terms of not technically applying their casting stats. But here's the thing, we assume it's bugged. Technically speaking, we don't have any code or anything saying, well, that's the way it's meant to be. And frankly, this game has always done things in a bit of a weird way, so I was hoping to explore a few theories here in terms of how or why this might potentially happen. So let's go ahead and explore the kinds of different things that we end up seeing. So for example, if we go down the different weapon types, we'll generally see cases where if we're looking, for example, at casting weapons, there's really only two-handed weapons that are really affected by this to any degree, which would be the Wise Man's Staff and the Sage Staff. So as the Relic states, basically for the purposes of casting exclusively, everything else is applying correctly, but for the purposes of casting exclusively, Int and Mind wouldn't appear on these two staves, which is kind of whatever. These are two staves that, generally speaking, tend to not really see the light of day anyway, just due to the fact that, well, you can apply a parry option with any of the other ones, and if you're using Lipples, I mean, you're basically getting the same bonus anyway. Anyway, so, in terms of overall practical effect, this doesn't really necessarily do very much. It just means Lipples is better than these two stupid things. Technically speaking, Cursed Cudgel could be used for more like physical hitting type of builds, because it's got its own thing going on. So either way, it's really only these two that are affected. Now, technically speaking, again, this wouldn't be 100% the case. Like, for example, technically, this wouldn't be applying its 3 Mind, which is less than 1% of what somebody's probably getting their damage from at this point anyway. So in most cases, you generally speaking wouldn't see it applying, but in terms of the elemental bonus, that part's interesting, because there is some theories on this. Usually you don't see stuff applied in a very broad way like this. Like when it comes to hand slots, they've got some quirks. Namely, if you are, for example, using a shield, it uses different rules, where, as I understand it, from what Recession's dug up in terms of testing what bonuses are applying where, supposedly the shields are applying double their listed stats and essentially, well, are functioning as their own thing. They've always kind of functioned as their own thing. Even back in the PSP version, they use different rules. And this actually has multiple different functions, and basically just means that you wouldn't be able to combine things like a shield and an ability, which has, it has a bunch of positive benefits for being programmed in that way. Namely, for example, something like a Berserker doesn't want to use their Berserk, then they go and they hit with their shield instead. It's still going to do a decent amount of damage. If somebody just wants to knock a unit backwards without having to worry about, for example, going and wasting, like, let's say, a Mighty Strike they set up or something like that, they wouldn't have to burn it. In a case where they just want to knock something backwards quickly, the recovery time on shields is lower, so it's a practical decision to make. And this is something that you see the AI doing pretty regularly too, wherein they'll go and they'll slap something with a shield if they see the option for a kill, or if they see an option for opening up a lane. Now, that's kind of a bit of a vague description for what they do there, but generally speaking, if an AI sees the opportunity to gain some ground, in many cases they'll go approach a unit from the flank, they'll hit him with a shield, and then immediately put another unit forward. So while that doesn't come up very often, we already even know from interviews that they were programmed to understand how choke points work, so either way, you'll see situations like that every now and then, but they've got a lot of sort of conflicting orders that they're supposed to pick and choose from in different situations. We obviously don't know the specifics, but based on stuff that I've seen, like they'll attempt to avoid friendly fire, but for example, if they see multiple kills, they will gladly take friendly fire. Or for example, they will generally speaking always try to go for a kill, but they will still also attempt to save time. That's why they use a shield bash instead. Or, for example, like, let's say they see a unit that's standing next to a cliff, then they would see, okay, I see time savings, plus I see kill potential, off the cliff they go. That kind of stuff. And this is actually why you can regularly see where if you park a unit without steadfast next to a cliff, oh boy, are those archers going to be targeting them, because they all have knockback, at least rank 1 built in. Suddenly you'll notice pretty clearly that every archer on the map is targeting that guy, because they see the potential for an instant kill. Anyway, but we're getting off into the AI here. But mainly what I wanted to say was that, yeah, obviously the shields are using their own rules, but additionally the hands themselves use different rules as well. So for example, if you were to use these things right here, the stats from your main hand weapon are not... So here's the thing. This is a thing that was listed as a bug in some cases, and it's not really a bug as much as, I guess you could call it a balance feature. So if you apply a weapon in your right hand, like right here, it would say, okay, this unit is using 8 dexterity, 6 agility, and 8 avoidance. You can think of it as, okay, when this weapon is in active use, so for example, it's in your right hand, it's considered in active use, it's the thing that you're equipping and you're using whatever else, and you can think of whatever's in the second slot as kind of your offhand, like your offhand and your belt, what have you. Like if you're, for example, running something along the lines of blowgun plus bow, this is a pretty usable thing. Whenever you are considered using that weapon in your main hand, you will get its bonuses. But if, for example, you were to go for something like this, then you would apply... Actually, this probably wouldn't be the blowgun to use for this. Let's go ahead and use this. Right here, it would apply some of its bonuses when you're using the bow, and it would use the bow's bonuses when you're actually directly firing the bow. So the stuff that isn't directly involved in damage calculations, stuff like luck, would end up carrying over, so like luck and health bonuses and what have you, meaning that for all intents and purposes that you can see putting a blowgun in your main hand as potentially adding 15 luck to your bow. So if you're not using a shield, if you're not using a parry option, what have you, it might potentially be a practical choice for what you're doing. If anyone's watched Level 1 run, you saw that I was abusing this extensively with Garish's blowguns back in the PSP version. And you might notice this is due to some weapons having very bizarre bonuses. Stuff like the mute dart, for example, would end up getting a lot of very sharp damage spikes with that extra 10 stats over there. Something like the Petra dart has 15 strength and 6 vitality on there, meaning if you're using this in your main hand, you are way more sturdy. But yeah, just kind of stuff to consider. Again, you're getting pretty decent... you can actually set up a pretty interesting avoidance build using the Damascus blowgun with that extra 8 avoidance on there. It's not very often that you see a full avoidance build being available, but either way, you know, you take them when you get them. You can see some interesting stuff out of that. But at any rate, the idea here is just, yeah, these slots are working differently because, well, they all are attempting to do different things. If you could stack all of these things, then, you know, you might see some, well, a lot of the game breaks that you saw back in the SNES version. I'm pretty sure somebody has some traumatic memories about that particular version, because there's some wackiness that happens, but it also leads to some interesting build options, where, for example, you might use, like, early on, you might go for the extra strength bonus off the Aspis, and later on, you're probably going and using these scaling defenses more than anything else, but in some cases, you still might look at something like this, and it's like, well, you know, I have a, like, let's say a class that can cast and use this at the same time, or for example, like right here, let's say I want to get this int bonus off this shield, and I'm going to go ahead and combine this and kind of synergize it with a casting weapon, something like like let's say an aqua hammer. We'll just pretend that he's a water element in this case, and so that would apply that extra, that kind of extra intelligence there. However, the way that this bug is concerned, this would mean that this one-handed hammer also would be applying its bonus right here with that 22% extra bonus if both, or rather if the spell itself was super effective. So if the unit and the spell were both super effective, it would apply its bonus. It would just be extra super effective, so to speak. One thing to note, though, that it isn't exactly like a flat thing. As far as the exact formula goes, this thing is... let's just say it's complicated. No one off the draw, like, even even Recession, with all of his trying to figure out all the formula for months now, I guarantee probably wouldn't be able to just directly look at a number and be like, yep, this is the exact reason why this exact thing is coming here. It still probably would take some double checking. All of this stuff is intended to be confusing because these numbers are more for the purpose of, like, you know, you're looking at your car. You don't necessarily need to understand the piston firing order in your engine to understand how it all works, but it might be useful if somebody's trying to, you know, troubleshoot a problem. Anyway, so back to the bug in question. So this would mean if, for example, something like an aqua hammer or other casting type of weapon were to be matched to your particular element, you know, you might get a bit of an extra bonus off that, which means that most of the classes that are actually benefiting from this are also the same ones that would have been used for caster builds back in the PSP version. Like, realistically, you probably wouldn't be using a no-toss as a casting weapon. It might apply a little bit more, but you may notice that the two-handed ones, while this isn't a universal rule, typically come with also higher values for some of these things in some cases. Now, I'm not saying, again, it's a one-to-one. I'm just not really sure that this was actually intended for all weapon types. It's too oddly specific. You don't usually see something broadly apply, again, to multiple different categories in this specific of a way. Again, the no-toss, typically speaking, like, if you were to swing this, you would still get its 18% physical bonus, you would still get its 29% elemental bonus if hitting on an earth unit. The only thing you'd actually be missing out on in terms of this bug is if you were to go and shoot it right here, you would lose the, like, something like of an 8 damage difference, give or take, from the intelligence bonus off of it, and then the, if you were to be an air unit matching your air weapon, then you wouldn't get the additional 29% in this case. But again, we're talking about, since it's earlier in the formula, again, technically speaking, give or take, you will generally not see, like, a gigantic bonus off of this. So either way, while it does have its uses, I don't think in this particular case that it was intended for the two-handers anyway. I mean, pretty much everything else that I've gone and tried to reach out to them for has been addressed in some ways, like in, for example, whenever there were descriptions that were messed with, whenever there were like bugs in terms of certain crashes or certain things not applying in other cases. Generally speaking, if there was a direct bug, they directly either mentioned it or dealt with it or what have you. Again, you know, see what happened with the Knight Commander weapons that one time, where for a while we were getting the AI versions instead of the player versions of these weapons, because there's a lot of different versions of some weapons. You know, go ahead and see the cheat Lombardia for that. But what I'm trying to get at here is that, yeah, most of that stuff was addressed, but when it came to other stuff, like we thought elemental armor was bugged for a while, that turned out to just be something different. We thought elemental weapons were bugged for quite a while, that turned out to just work differently. When it comes to this, I feel like the benefits that are gotten here are so oddly specific that I personally have two theories, but I'm going to go address the many different ways this could be seen. We could directly see it as, you know, as just a bug, somebody's finger slipped, they put a wrong number somewhere, what have you. But in the case of, again, to me that seems a little oddly specific, considering that it's a very broad way that this can potentially impact stuff. So either way, that's theory A. Theory B is going to be, when it comes to the AI, you'll notice in a lot of cases the AI will be running around looking like this. This is the other case where it would actually apply. So, for example, right now, if he were to go out looking like this, it would not apply that bonus. It would simply say, okay, you don't get that 12 intelligence, you don't get that 7 mind, you don't get that 25 bonus off your stick. So, essentially, you may notice in a lot of cases that the AI will be specifically running around with stuff like this, which is very oddly specific. Like, in other cases they use shields, in other cases in more plot-related fights they'll use shields, but when they're allowed to spawn equipment, more often than not, they seem to be running around like this. Now, personally, I got a theory on this that's very oddly specific. Basically, before release happened, there was a brief moment where the crescent bow, which normally looks a little bit like this, let's go ahead and pull that up here. So the crescent bow is normally blue, right? It's got its blue right here. It's got its blue background. All the relics have a red background. I know that when I was playing before release, when I got my early review copy and stuff like that, for a brief period of time, this had a red background. Now, the weird part about this is, I mean, it basically looked like the Pajra does here. Now, the weird part about this is, well, it still wasn't a relic, and frankly, I still don't have that version, because when I had first gotten that drop, that same drop was then collected by another unit that I unknowingly shot off a cliff, and for a while I thought drops were bugged, but it turns out, no, they just got shot off a cliff. My point is, if there were relics in the hands of the AI that were allowed to spawn at that point, there's a pretty reasonable possibility that, that they were just simply scared of players, or players getting destroyed by this bonus in some cases. It's a minor one, but you can see how potentially it might just get out of hand if it was on something that, for example, was abused by every unit on the map. So that's kind of another theory, that maybe this was just sort of done on purpose as a, well, let's just kind of have this safety feature, so to speak. Again, it's kind of weird, but given how stuff normally goes, I wouldn't be too shocked to see something weird like that in there. But again, that's just a kind of out there crackpot theory. It's certainly possible as far as I'm concerned from the kinds of stuff that we have seen in the development of many of these games, but either way, just a theory. So another theory that I think is actually way more likely is actually a bit of a leftover, is that this was a leftover feature. Because let's think for a second in terms of the stuff that it affects, because broadly, the way that this is seen by a lot of folks is, well, this means that all one-handed relics are just superior to the two-handed ones, and for all intents and purposes, they aren't. In most cases, if you try to, for example, compare a sword with a staff, even a basic staff, like when I was doing this test earlier, I was comparing the pinion blade with its 24% bonus over here, and then I was comparing that with an air staff. And the difference between them was 2 damage, because the actual intelligence bonus off the air staff was far more than this thing could bring to bear. Typically speaking, the actual casting weapons are going to be stacking int and mind pretty severely, on top of the fact that you may have additional int and mind bonuses off the shields that they're equipping. Meaning that, for all intents and purposes, this was not doing very much. It's kind of a niche, well, that's kind of neat type situation. But getting 2 extra damage at the cost of your general purpose damage is usually not worth it in that case, meaning that there's really only the stabs that are getting affected. Now, I don't have a Sagara on this particular save file, but this would mean that the Ripple's Rod and Sagara would be the main ones that are actually affected by this, right? Which is interesting, because again, this would be 2 stabs that are generally kind of a pain in the neck to get a hold of. Ripple's Rod is by far the easier of the 2. The Sagara would involve a ungodly amount of grinding to get into any reasonable state. The Ripple's Rod is annoying but doable. But in this particular case, we'd be talking about 1 stick that just generally would shine above the rest, which is, it's fine. Realistically speaking, considering that you're getting this hundreds of hours into the game, having 1 staff get a very specific bonus in one specific situation 1/8 of the time is not really something that anyone's going to bother trying to break anything else in the game for. And again, this is functionally a non-issue for most of the rest of these weapons here. Even with fairly high bonuses, you'll typically see something like, let's say, a Valkyrie running something like a Lesker's here, and okay, they're going to be doing a little bit better some of the time, but it's not going to be earth-shattering or anything like that. It's going to be a nice little bonus, and potentially they're also giving up the fact that they'd be able to split their elements otherwise. So, again, not a huge deal, but personally what I think this was from the Relic Brynhildr. It's the only one of the one-handed weapons, to my knowledge off the top of my head right now. I think it's Assassin Blade can reach 30, but there's very few weapons that can actually reach that full 30 bonus. As far as I'm aware, it would be the highest of the swords here, but interesting part of it is that the Relic Brynhildr is kind of an odd addition, isn't it? It's a case where, okay, it's essentially a new sword being added, just a fancier version of a thing that's already pretty darn good. We're looking at a case where it's going to be not one of, but the hardest thing to get a hold of in the game, requiring you to do Code of 4 with only 3 characters. For those unaware of what this means that you have every Knight Commander and the boss 20 levels higher than you, decked out in relics, and you are outnumbered by fighting every single one of them. They are there with a terrain advantage, they're there with more than likely a gear advantage, skill advantage, numbers advantage. They've got additional units with them at the same time, and I believe it is a 3 versus 24 fight. So yeah, it's basically it's just a check for how much you've mastered the mechanics at that point. But if you do this, then there's a small percentage chance drop to get not only Alphonse's sword, but also the Relic Brynhildr, which, again, like all of the relics, would mean that you'd have to obtain this multiple times in order to rank it up, which is, again, a obscene amount of effort for basically just a shinier version of something you already have. It's a trophy, right? But let's think about how this bug interacts with things. That it's only one-handers. It seems to be a case where it pretty much would be universally effective for different spell types, meaning that as far as weapons go, lore-wise, that would kind of make sense for the Brynhilder, right? Like, technically it's listed as a divine thing, but it's more or less considered the Excalibur of this universe, give or take. And while there have been, certain weapons to go and apply shiny things as well, this thing literally says that it's supposed to have the power of the stars with it. One of the Sagara cudgel you end up getting from, well, a frickin' Heaven General. And in the case of the Relic Brynhilder, I mean, it's, again, just kind of a weird case that it would get outshone in other things with this kind of mechanic, right? I mean, 3 resurrections, you probably don't even need to resurrect stuff at that point. But this might be an interesting take on that idea. So personally, I feel the way that it went is that they were trying to make this a unique function of the weapon. They probably still had it in the code somewhere, maybe just got distracted, didn't finish it, what have you, and then it just sort of wound up getting lost in the ether. And at this point, it's one of the things that does get the benefit, and so do many other things. But again, that's just another theory. To be frank, as far as actual evidence in code and what have you, as far as I'm aware, I've been asking around for a while. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing to directly state exactly the cause of this whole thing, or necessarily where it came from, or what it's actually supposed to be affecting. So either way, if I actually find out any hard data on that, if somebody can point to some line of code somewhere saying, here, this is clearly what somebody intended, then yeah, that would be a different story. But in terms of the overall effect of it, really all the, again, true effect of it is just Valkyries get an easier time 1/8 of the time. The 2 end game stabs over here that realistically aren't really any more useful than any of these ones, because, for example, why exactly wouldn't you use any of these other stabs over something like this? Because parry is a gigantic deal for casters. It's just straight up not worth it to use these 2, even if they did provide the bonus, if we're being completely honest. Either way, we're looking at a case where just, Ripples is better than Sage and Wise Man's, and aside from that, you occasionally see, some errant numbers here or there. Imagine a case where, for example, you were running Deneb and you were running the Cat of Nine Tails, and suddenly she had AoEs that were benefiting from an extra 25% bonus against an entire map. It would be kind of hilarious, right? But again, I just don't think some of these things were intended to provide a casting bonus. In a lot of cases, you'll see that they have practically no actual bonuses as far as stats go. In other cases, like these universal stat weapons, you'll notice that, those are the values that are clearly lower than anything else anyway. Or again, in many cases, they're just simply not there. To me, it just doesn't scream like it was intended to be used in that case, And again, I am aware that obviously some of them come with casting effects on there, and if, for example, you were to use something like the Sweep Blade, you still would get pretty solid numbers if you were running a dark unit using this. But again, the weapon itself doesn't really have any ginormous bonuses as far as that goes. The highest exception to this would be something like the Crescent Sword there, and that's still like 5. It's not necessarily going to be, again, earth-shattering by any degree. I guess it also means that technically stuff like Exarch's staff would suck a little bit more, but they don't even have an element bonus, and realistically speaking, you get these early enough, and they're not relics anyway, so I think it actually doesn't even apply to them anyway. Earlier on, you might use something like a Boulder Spear, which as far as I'm aware, I think the Boulder Spear still does apply its bonus, but realistically, it's barely anything anyway. Either way, hopefully you see what I'm getting at with this. It's a weird and interesting kind of rabbit hole with this bug. It's got some very particular niche uses, but realistically, this isn't actually coloring anyone's experience. This actually came up as a discussion point the other day, because it's not again, it's not that it completely doesn't exist. It's just, again, it's very specific. Most of the time, even if you are running this, there's probably going to be a bit of a complication in terms of when you'd actually use it. And the funny part is, later on, if you were to use relic weapons and stuff like that, in most cases, the actual bonus it provides would just be eaten by anything wearing a dragon scale, which is practically going to be every hoplite or heavier unit later on. Actually, to further back up that AI theory from earlier, I can't help but notice that pretty much the only relics that the characters will use, for the most part, are the two-handed ones. And specifically, you'll notice that even in cases where they're using a relic shield or something, they'll usually be using like an ice blade or something with it. There might be exceptions. Again, could totally be missing details here or there, but as far as I can remember off the top of my head, even in Coda 4, in most cases, I know you see units running around with a raise. As far as I don't think I've ever seen one running around with a relic dagger. I've never seen them running around with one of those. Did they ever run around with an Erasean? That might be the one exception. I don't think so. You see Durandals every now and then. I think I've seen the procs show up. Let's see. I know you do see Bentiscas. The I think they do use the Veritas. What else? I don't recall ever seeing any of these. I think I've seen a guy with a crescent sword before, but I'm not positive. Yeah, it seems to be the intent there, you know? It feels like a reasonable theory to me. Like, you see Thunderbows later. This is why they're so dang easy to farm, and you see stuff like Rude Bows. Those are pretty easy to farm. You see the Bandika Chikmaki, however the hell you're supposed to pronounce that, later on, and you see a lot of dragon shields and stuff like that. Anyway, so let me know what theories y'all have. I just thought this was an interesting topic of discussion, and have yourselves a good one. Take care.